2 forgotten movements, 2 cities. 1. Classified FBI file. Oakland, 1966. Black Panthers. Aim for armed resistance. Minneapolis, 1968. Anishinaabe and Dakota leaders parallel their strategy. 22 months apart, roughly the length of a U.S. presidential campaign cycle. And within a year of each founding, the FBI had opened a file on both of them. The word they used in both files was the same: neutralize. Most people know one of these stories. Almost nobody knows both. And when you put them side by side, something shifts. You stop seeing 2 separate civil rights stories and start seeing one federal strategy. That is what this video is about. 2 movements, 1 playbook used against them. Let us set the stage, both stages at the same time. Oakland, 1966. A port city where African American residents made up roughly 34% of the population. That is approximately 124,000 people concentrated in specific neighborhoods, facing a predominantly white police force. Minneapolis, 1968. One of the largest urban Native American populations in the United States. Estimates range from 10,000 to 13,000 Ojibwe and Dakota residents concentrated in the Phillips and Franklin Avenue neighborhoods. Both cities, both communities, both experiencing the same documented pattern: police stops, police violence, no accountability. But here is a detail most people miss about Minneapolis. Those Ojibwe and Dakota residents did not simply migrate to the city the way other Americans moved for work. They were placed there by federal policy. The Indian Relocation Act of 1956 paid Native families to leave reservations and resettle in designated urban centers. Minneapolis was one of those centers, which means the community AIM would organize was not organically urban, it was federally engineered to be urban. Smith and Warriors Like a Hurricane documents the sources cited here. The government moved these families off their land, relocated them to a city, and then failed to protect them in that city. That context makes everything that happens next legible. Now, meet the founders both sets, and notice the structural rhyme. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, 2 young black men in Oakland, both with legal training, both with deep anger at what they witnessed on the streets. They founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense on October 15, 1966. Not in a government building, in a poverty neighborhood, with a mimeograph machine and a stack of state law books. 22 months later, in Minneapolis, Dennis Banks, Ojibwe, from the Leech Lake Band, and Clyde Bellecourt, also Ojibwe. Both men had spent time incarcerated, a detail that matters, because prison was where many of AIM's founders first organized. They and their co-founders launched the American Indian Movement in July 1968, also not in a government building, in a church basement, on Franklin Avenue. 2 founding moments. 2 rented rooms. 4 men who understood that the law existed, it just was not being applied to them. So they decided to apply it themselves. October 1966, Oakland. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale load shotguns into a car and begin following police cruisers through black neighborhoods. California Penal Code, open on the dashboard, legal, documented, deliberate. When police stopped a black resident, Newton would step out, cite the law, and inform the resident of their rights loudly, in front of witnesses. The tactic was not random confrontation. It was structured, legal theater, performed in public, for the community. On the street, the smell of exhaust on those Oakland streets, the low idle of a police cruiser, the sound of a law book opening. 22 months later, Minneapolis, Franklin Avenue. AIM members load into cars and cruise the same kinds of streets. Bars, corners, the places where Ojibwe and Dakota men were being stopped and roughed up outside closing time. Minnesota statutes in hand. Constitutional rights ready to be cited. Same structure, same tactic. Different city, different community. This was not coincidence. Urban organizers across movements in the 1960s were watching each other, reading each other's pamphlets, attending the same conferences, sharing tactics across community lines. The Citizen Patrol was a technology. AIM learned it in part by watching the Panthers deploy it first. Patrol tactic match. Legal citation as confrontation tool match. Target. Police violence against a specific urban community match. Founding conditions structurally parallel, culturally distinct. Now we go to the documents. Because the documents are where this gets uncomfortable. In 1968, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover formally designated the Black Panther Party the, quote, greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The organization was 2 years old. It had launched a community patrol and a political program. That same year, 1968, the FBI opened a domestic counterintelligence file on AIM. AIM was weeks old. Both organizations were under federal surveillance before they had done anything beyond walking their own neighborhoods with law books. This is the COINTELPRO program, the FBI's counterintelligence program, and it is the thread that connects both stories underneath the surface. Think of COINTELPRO as a franchise operation. The FBI did not invent a new suppression strategy for each movement it targeted. It applied the same playbook to different cities the way a chain opens the same restaurant in different zip codes. AIM and BPP got the same menu. Different locations. The internal memos pried loose decades later, under the Freedom of Information Act, used nearly identical language in both files. Neutralize, exploit internal tensions, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify the movement. 1 classified vocabulary. 2 communities. 2 FBI field offices running the same operation simultaneously. But what came next, this part, is almost never taught side by side. Let us go to the 10-point programs, because they reveal something structural. October 1966, Newton and Seal draft the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. It demands land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and an end to police brutality and release of political prisoners. AIM's parallel demands, formalized in documents from the early 1970s, match that structure almost point for point. Sovereignty over community institutions, end to police brutality, release of political prisoners. Programmatic demands match. Community sovereignty language match. Then AIM added one demand that no BPP document could contain: the enforcement of 371 ratified treaties between the United States and native nations. 371. That is more legal agreements than the U.S. has signed with all foreign nations combined. These were not protest slogans. They were citations of existing federal law already passed, already ratified, already broken, without exception. This is the structural divergence the scorecard must mark clearly. BPP was demanding civil rights within U.S. law, pushing the country to live up to its own constitution. AIM was demanding treaty rights that are U.S. law, the supreme law of the land, per Article 6 of the Constitution, already ratified, already violated. That is not the same demand. That is a fundamentally different legal terrain, and it produced a fundamentally different kind of confrontation with the federal government. AIM's legal framework operated on 2 simultaneous terrains: U.S. federal law and treaty law as sovereign agreements between nations. BPP operated within a city where Black residents had voting power inside an established municipal framework. AIM operated across both urban Minneapolis and reservation lands where tribal sovereignty, not municipal law, was the governing structure. One movement pushing from inside the system, one movement invoking a legal status that predated the system. Now watch what both movements built when the system refused to serve them. By 1969, the Black Panther Party had launched its free breakfast for school children program, approximately 49 sites nationally. An estimated 10,000 children per day fed before school by some accounts, the largest free breakfast program in the country before the federal government created its own. The federal government adopted a version of the very program it was actively working to dismantle. AIM built parallel institutions in Minneapolis. The Heart of the Earth Survival School, founded 1971. The Red Schoolhouse in St. Paul, 1972. K-12 education in Ojibwe and Dakota communities, completely outside the Bureau of Indian Affairs-controlled school system. The BIA schools had been the machinery of assimilation for decades, the same institutional lineage as boarding schools. AIM's survival schools were a direct counter-architecture, community-controlled, culturally grounded, built because the official system had been a weapon. Parallel institutions built outside federal systems match. Purpose: feed and educate the community. The government had failed match. BPPs, 49 breakfast sites nationally, versus AIM schools, serving a specific urban community in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Different scales, same structural logic. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. By 1971, FBI COINTELPRO operations against AIM had intensified beyond surveillance. Internal FBI memos released later under FOIA show agents instructed to, quote, exploit factionalism within AIM chapters. That language, exploit factionalism, appears in nearly identical form in internal FBI directives issued against BPP chapters in 1968 through 1970. Same sentence. Different letterhead. The tactics documented in these files included infiltration by informants, use of agent provocateurs to manufacture internal conflict, and the engineering of prosecutions designed to drain movement resources through legal fees. Federal prosecution rates against both movements were extraordinary. AIM leaders Dennis Banks and Russell Means faced approximately 185 combined charges following the 1973 Wounded Knee occupation. 185 charges against 2 men. On December 11, 1974, Judge Fred Nickel dismissed the majority, finding prosecutorial misconduct so severe that the case could not stand. The government had manufactured the prosecution. The judge said so from the bench. BPP founder Huey Newton faced multiple prosecutions between 1967 and 1974, charges that cycled through courts for years, consuming movement, energy, and resources. Federal prosecution a suppression tool match. Prosecutorial misconduct documented match. The Church Committee, the U.S. Senate investigation, concluded in 1976, confirmed all of it in public record. COINTELPRO operations against both AIM and BPP, infiltration, agent provocateurs, manufactured prosecutions, parallel suppression, documented by the U.S. Senate in the 1970s. And most people have never heard these two stories told together. Now we arrive at the emotional core of this comparison, and Dennis Banks said it in a way that cuts through everything. Quote, "We were not trying to be the Black Panthers. We were trying to survive in a city that did not want us to exist." That quote does two things at once. It honors the independence of AIM's founding. This was not imitation, it was survival. And it reveals that survival in 1968 Minneapolis looked almost structurally identical to survival in 1966 Oakland because the threat was structurally identical. Not the same history, not the same culture, not the same legal framework, but the same federal government, the same documented pattern of police violence, the same classified word in the files, neutralize. Now we go to the one metric where the scorecard shows a clear divergence, and it matters for understanding both movements' legacies. The Black Panther Party dissolved as a national organization by approximately 1982, 16 years after founding. Worn down by prosecutions, internal conflict, some of it FBI manufactured, and the death and imprisonment of key leaders, AIM did not dissolve. AIM transitioned into a network of autonomous chapters, spin-off organizations, and affiliated institutions. The AIM Grand Governing Council continues to operate in Minneapolis. The National Coalition on Racism in Sports and Media grew from AIM roots. Why the difference? Part of the answer may be that structure itself. AIM was never a single national organization in the BPP sense. It was always more federated, more like a network of sovereign nodes than a centralized party. And sovereignty, the concept AIM built its legal framework around, is a harder thing to dissolve than a party membership. Organizational continuity divergence. BPP, centralized and dissolved. AIM, federated and persisted. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because the parallel between these two founding moments did not end in the 1970s. It is still active. In 2016, at the Standing Rock encampment in North Dakota, Movement for Black Lives organizers joined Lakota and Dakota water protectors on the front line. That coalition, Black and Indigenous, side by side, did not emerge from nowhere. It had a 50-year origin point, 2 cars, 2 cities, 2 groups of men who made the same decision in the same political moment. The 1968 founding parallel is not historical trivia. It is the origin point of an alliance that is still being built in 2025 and 2026. The Land Back movement and the movement for Black Lives frequently operate in coalition today, on land rights, on policing, on federal accountability. And when you trace that coalition back to its roots, you arrive at Franklin Avenue in Minneapolis and a church basement in July 1968. Now let us do the final scorecard, all metrics, side by side. Founding condition: police violence against a specific urban community, both movements, confirmed. Founding tactic: citizen patrol with legal citation as confrontation tool, both movements, confirmed. Parallel institutions: community-controlled alternatives to failed government systems, both movements, confirmed. FBI COINTELPRO targeting: opened within 1 to 2 years of founding, using nearly identical classified language, both movements, confirmed. Programmatic demands: structure demanding sovereignty, end to police brutality, release of political prisoners, both movements, confirmed. Key structural difference: BPP demanded rights within U.S. law. AIM demanded rights that were already U.S. law, treaty law, and already broken. Organizational outcome: BPP centralized and dissolved by approximately 1982. AIM federated and persisted in autonomous form to the present. Federal prosecution as suppression, documented in both cases, with judicial findings of prosecutorial misconduct confirmed in AIM trials. 1974. The scorecard does not tell you which movement was more important. It is not built to do that. No scorecard is. What it does tell you is this: the federal government treated both movements as equivalent threats and deployed equivalent tools against them before either movement had done anything beyond organizing their own communities. That is not a coincidence. That is a policy. And when you understand that policy, something that seemed like 2 separate stories becomes one story about how the United States responds when communities organize themselves to survive. Dennis Banks died in 2019, 51 years after he helped found AIM in a church basement on Franklin Avenue. In 2025, Leonard Peltier, an AIM member imprisoned since 1977, was released after 49 years, one of the longest-held political prisoners in U.S. history. His case had run parallel to AIM's history the entire time, a living document of what COINTELPRO-era prosecution looked like across decades. The founding moment of July 1968 was 22 months behind Oakland, but it was part of the same political season, the same anger at the same documented pattern, the same decision to walk out with law books instead of silence, the same federal response waiting in a file drawer, already written, already classified. The question this scorecard leaves you with is not which movement was more effective or more justified. The question is simpler and harder than that. If the same federal apparatus used the same tactics to suppress 2 different communities asking the same basic question, why do police treat us as criminals in our own neighborhoods? What does that tell you about which side of that question the government had already chosen? 22 months apart, one political moment, and the files to prove it. If this parallel surprised you, if you knew one story and not both, share this video with someone who knows the other one. The sources are in the description: Smith and Warriors Like a Hurricane, Bloom and Martin's Black Against Empire, and the Church Committee Report, a public government document you can read today. Put the stories in the same room. See what they say to each other. The sources for everything are in the description: Smith and Warriors Like a Hurricane, Bloom and Martin's Black Against Empire, and the Church Committee Report, which is a public government document you can read today. History does not silo itself. We do that. And we can stop. 22 months apart. One political moment. And the files to prove it.